I made up some charts of the 5 main kinds of sacrifices. It's because it can get kind of confusing with all these different kinds of sacrifices, and for this sacrifice you'll do it like this one, and you do this other thing like you did that other one, and it just gets all kind of mixed up.
Sounds like Texas Chainsaw Massacre almost, man. I was
Thank
like,
you.
all this blood sprinkling and throwing, and it's a lot more than just sacrificing the animal, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so just to go through them real quick, in Leviticus 1, it talks about the Olah, the burnt offering. It's where we get the word Holocaust. It comes from the Olah. And it means something completely burned up. It's a voluntary, in most cases, it's a voluntary sacrifice. Why he said to do the sacrifices the way that he said to do them is kind of a mystery. We don't really know. Since there are a lot of parallels with pagan ritual, there's probably some functional reason why each sacrifice had to be done the way it was, why some had to be this kind of animal and some that kind of animal. There's something that's actually going on spiritually or physically, for all we know. It's not random. It's not just an object lesson. I mean, God is trying to teach us things through it, and they are shadows of something higher, but they're also doing something. So the exact method and the exact animals and who does what, all of these things are important. You just can't make up your own ritual and say, well, it's a shadow of Yeshua. So, we can do it however we want as long as it shows us this thing. Of course, we don't have a temple today. We don't have a functioning priesthood, not a Levitical priesthood anyways. So we can't do these kind of sacrifices because you can only do them at the one place that God said that's where he's going to put his name. And he said that's in Jerusalem. So nobody can do these right now. So with the burnt offering, everything is burned up except the hide. Well, that depends on the animal. I think for bulls and goats and sheep, the hide is preserved and that goes to the priests. Everything else is burned up. With birds, they don't say the hide on birds. They burn it all up. Second one in Leviticus 2 is the Minkhah. And we call it a grain offering, but it's not strictly a grain offering. That's the most common form is a grain offering, but there are other places in scripture where it talks about somebody giving a minchah, and it's not grain, it's an animal or first fruits. So it can be all kinds of different things, but the point of it is offering tribute to your God, saying, I got all this stuff from you, so I'm giving some of it back because it's all yours anyways. And that's really the point of a minchah. The next one is the peace offering, sometimes called a thanks offering in Leviticus 3. In Hebrew, it's the Zavach Shelamim. And Shelamim, same root word as shalom, which is why it's called peace offering. This one is usually voluntary also. There are a couple of exceptions, but usually voluntary. Some of the offering is burned up, like the organ fat in the tail, that's burned up. A quarter of it, I think it's like the right front leg and the right shoulder goes to the priest. Everything else goes back to the one who's bringing the offering, and they have a big barbecue with family and friends and everybody else who came to Jerusalem with them. And they have 3 days to eat it, so they can't bring it back home unless they live nearby. So if you're going to participate in a peace offering, you pretty much have to travel to Jerusalem with the person who's making it. But it's all about relationship. It's all about spending time with God, spending time with your community and your family, and building those relationships, which is probably why it's called a peace offering. And then there's the sin offering. And we use the word sin differently than Torah does. I mean, even in the New Testament, they use that word differently. It's not the same word because it's Greek instead of Hebrew, obviously, but it's mostly for sins of ignorance or weakness. You didn't know that you did something. Like you didn't know this was a sin and you did it. Or you accidentally did something, or you just had a moment of weakness and, you stole that candy bar just because you've got a real weakness for chocolate. I don't know. There are 2 cases where you might call it a sin of rebellion, and that's failure to testify at a crime and then making a false oath knowingly. So if you know that there's a crime and they call for witnesses and you don't come forward, well, now you've sinned and you know it's wrong and you're still doing it. But you could also call that a sin of weakness because you're scared or whatever. In making a false oath. sin is a trespass. It's going somewhere where you're not supposed to go, touching something you're not supposed to touch. But we think of sin as acts of rebellion. I know God said to do this, but I don't care. I'm going to do this other thing. And that is a sin, but that doesn't cover all kinds of sin. And in fact, according to Torah, there are many things that are classified as sin, which are not actually violations of Torah. For example, we are commanded to be fruitful and multiply, to have children. But that requires a sin offering. A woman who has given birth has to go and make a sin sacrifice, even though she hasn't sinned. So I can only speculate as to why. Maybe it has something to do with the same reason that she's got this 40 or 80-day period of uncleanness after giving birth, because there's this close connection with death. Bringing life into the world, you also go through a period of right at death's door. Maybe that has to do with it. I don't really know. And the last one is the guilt offering. And it's a little confusing why, between sin and guilt, but that again has to do with the limitations of our English language, and they're just using different words that have different shades of meaning that don't translate well. And the guilt offering is mostly for sins against your neighbors. You made some kind of offense to people, and you're not sinning directly against God. It's only indirectly because you're sinning against somebody who bears his image. But you've still done something wrong. You're not actively rebelling against God. You're just being a jerk. So then you bring a guilt offering. And some of the things that we don't understand, if you take a Nazirite vow, and then when your vow period is done, you go and you shave your head and you offer some sacrifices. You make I believe you do a burnt offering, you do a peace offering, and a sin offering. And if at some point you accidentally violate your vow, drink wine, touch something unclean, then you do a guilt offering, which normally sins of accidents are sin offerings. So it gets kind of confusing, and I don't really understand why things change, but it's much more complicated than most Christian theologians portray this.